Hello and welcome to Control-Delete Tutorials. I had a request to create a video talking about 3ds Max's modifiers. So that's what this video is going to be. I'm going to do two separate videos, so this will be the first of the two, which is going to be modifier basics or basic modifiers, and then the other video will be advanced modifiers, which will be a little bit more in depth on some of the modifiers. So if you don't know what a modifier is, with anything we have to start with an object. So I'm going to start out by just creating a box, and I'll make this a little bit tall. So in order for modifiers to even do something, we need our objects that we're using to have segments in them. They need to have something to modify, essentially. So when I create an object, this object is, a box, and I've got different length, width, and height segments for this object. Now if I go over to the Modify panel, over here I can currently modify some of these settings. So I can change my length, my width, and my height. Something that's very important when we're creating objects, if we want them to be aligned to our world coordinate system, being the X, Y, and Z, X being, as we can see here, the X. If I go to move, you can see this a little better. X is going to be left and right, Y is going to be our depth, and Z is going to be our vertical axis. 3ds Max is a little bit in the minority as far as this coordinate system. Most software are going to be X, which is correct, but Y and Z would be switched to where Y would be up and Z would be depth. So I will say 3ds Max has that a little different than other software. But whenever I created this object, I created it in the perspective view. The other way that I would create it is create it in the top view. So if I create this object and another one in the top view, and go back into perspective here, we can see that the height changes how tall it is. But if I go into the left view and I create a box, let's say I try to make a box that looks very similar to the boxes I have here. So that looks pretty close, right? But if I look at the height, this is my height. That's because I created it in the left view. So in this case, my length would actually make it taller, but notice how the length is changing in two directions. Well, that's because that's what the length does. So this object is not oriented to our scene. This becomes very important when we're adding modifiers, because the modifiers will affect this object based on their axes and their coordinate system. So it's really important. The other thing you can notice is this object's center point, or its pivot point, is along the side, whereas the boxes that I've created are along the bottom. So I'll move this guy out of the way for a minute, and we'll look at these. I don't need two of the same. Okay. So I'm going to take you down through the modifiers that are what I would consider to be most important for basic use. And so we're going to skip over our selection modifiers and our world space modifiers. We're going to come down to our object space modifiers, and that's going to be this long list here. And there's a lot of them. And we're not going to go through all these. We're going to go through the ones that typically I find to be the most important as far as, things that I've used over the, 15 years that I've been using 3D Studio Max. So we're going to start off very simply with the first one, bend. Now as I apply bend, you're going to see this orange cage kind of go around my object here. And it fits to the object. If I had a cylinder here, this might be a little bit easier to see. And we'll just apply bend to it. Okay, so here you can really see that orange cage. This is called a gizmo. And our gizmo is what actually affects our underlying object. So here with my box, I have my parameters here for bend angle and bend direction. Now here's the thing, if I start bending this, notice how the gizmo is trying its best to bend this object, but there's no segments here. I don't have any segments, so it can't bend. So over on the side here, this is our modifier stack. So our original object is at the bottom of the stack, and then every modifier that we add goes on top of that stack. And the modifiers affect what's underneath them. So if I have a different modifier on top of this, this one will not affect the one above it. So it kind of has a chain of command there. But I can always go back to box in this case and say, let's add some more height segments. And notice how it is now bending to this, and it's following that. So that's really important. Excuse me. Now, let's go back to this box. So notice that this box, the bend modifier, is aligned to the z-axis. It's up axis. Now if I select this box, and you know what? I'm going to say let's give it some segments too. But I can't give it height segments like I could this one because its height is not the right direction. So in this case I'm going to give it length segments. I'm going to apply bend to it, and its bend is again in the z direction, but it's not in our world's z direction. It's actually in the object's z direction. So if I go to my hierarchy tab here, this allows me to show my pivot point by turning on effect pivot point only. And notice here, this is color coded. So red is X, Y is green, and Z is blue. And look where my blue is. Blue is this direction because I made it in the left view. So this is why this will be really important. I'm going to turn that back off and go back to modify. And now if I try to bend, notice how it's trying to bend along this object's z-axis, not the world z-axis. So this is why we want to create things in the top in perspective view. So I'll just delete that one by pressing delete on my keyboard. And I'll come back and talk about these. Now, if I use my bend here, we can see these two are bending the same way. I can come back down the cylinder and add height segments if I want this to bend a little more smoothly, just like I did with this one. Now we're going to come back to bend at the very end so I can show two modifiers working together. And it's really nice because it's one of the last ones that I'll cover, and it'll show how these modifier stacks work together. So under my parameters, again, I have my angle and I have my direction. If I change the direction, it changes the direction in degrees of that bend. So notice I've come back around here at almost 360 degrees. And you can kind of see how that works. And both of these settings can be animated. So if I turn on auto key and I go to 100 frames over, and I'll just set this at 90. Come on. 90. And I go back here and set this to 0. You can see now that that can be animated to bend. So if I play the animation, it's going to bend. Same thing can happen with my direction here. If I type in 360, it's going to set a key. Notice how these spinners turn red, or highlighted red. That's because they're animated. So now it bends and changes direction. Okay, we don't need animation for this, but just to give you an idea. And I'm spending more time on this one just because I'm explaining kind of how modifiers work with a very basic one here, but just so you get an idea. So the bend axis, by default it's bending along the z-axis, the up axis. If I change it to y, it will bend along the y-axis. So I turn on y, and I bend, and it bends along the y. And again, this looks a little weird. There's also no segments that direction. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to type in 10 and 10, just so I have enough segments here to bend in pretty much any direction. So now we can actually see that bend taking place that direction. And if I come to X, then it bends this direction. And it will bend in on itself, so that's weird. We're going to go back to the Z direction because I want to show some things. So there's this little rollout here. If we twirl that open, we're going to get access to the different parts of the gizmo here. So we can actually affect the gizmo and move it. So if I move the gizmo outside of this, notice how the object is bending to the outer amount of this, and if I move this direction, it's now bending based on the inner part of here. And if I move it left and right, nothing really happens because the direction hasn't changed here. So I'm going to reset that. And typically you want your objects to be centered in there, but I could do something like move my gizmo, and you can see how the bend is trying to follow. That's a little bit weird to get used to, but then we have the center point. So this changes where does it bend from. So I could have it bend from the top of the object here, based on that center point. And so now it bends this direction. Okay, so we can affect these. There's also a little light bulb here. If I turn that off, the modifier stops affecting. Turn it back on, and it starts affecting again. We also have limits here. So there's a limit effect that we can turn on, and it gives me an upper amount and a lower amount. So I'll show you what that does. So if I change this upper amount here, what it's doing is it's cutting off where that effect is happening. So it's bending only the bottom half, but the rest of it's staying straight. And as I tell this to affect further and further up, it'll now bend all the way up here. Also, if we notice here, my height is 53.449, and my limit effect here, 53.449, would be the very top of it. So it's using those units here. So we can tell it, only bend part of the way, or only bend so far down. So that's what our limit effects do. And then there's one for the bottom as well, but the bottom part, the center point of that, is already down at the bottom, so that's really going to affect nothing. And then we can turn that off. So that's bend. Very basic modifier. Really, really handy. I use it on so many different things. Let's go ahead and I'll leave this one in here. I'm going to remove the modifiers here by hitting the little trash can. So going down the list, let's see. Cloth is advanced. Displace. So displace, we can use something like a plane, and let's say we wanted to make terrain. So I could use 100 by 100 segments. Now this is giving me a lot of segments here, but based on how displace works, this is kind of ideal. So I'm going to put the displace modifier on here. Okay, so I've got a bunch of settings here, but you're not going to be able to see anything happen until I put an image in here for it to use. So let's see here. Go to thumbnails. I'll make skybox. Sure, why not? So I'm going to take this. I'm going to drag it into my image here. So what it's doing is it's going to put this image across all of this, and as I move my strength up, we can now use the thumbnail that I had created here. So how to create a skybox in Unity. So it's from this image, and what it's doing is it's using the luminance value of this image. So anything that is light or white will be pushed up, and anything that is dark or black will be pushed down. If I set it to luminance center, it's going to push out in both directions. If I don't have that on, black actually stays in place, or dark values. So white values will be pushed up. And you can use this to create terrain. So if you went into Photoshop and I painted an area along the edges here kind of white, and the areas in the center here kind of dark, then as I push this up, I could create like hills and terrain and stuff like that. And it works similar to the way a height map works in things like Unity for a terrain. So that's what Displace does. We can use a bitmap image, or we can use a texture map. And typically you're going to want this to be planar. It really depends on what the object is you're using. But that's what Displace does. So we're just going to delete that. And continue on our modifiers. So after that, Let's see here. Now edit mesh and edit poly. Typically we don't want to use these as modifiers. They do have their place, for sure, but it's better to convert an object to an editable poly rather than put this modifier on there if we're going to be editing. And the reason why is, let's say I take parts of my mesh here and I start extruding this. Okay, so I extrude. Okay, so the box is still lying under here, but every single polygon that I have, if I select one of the polygon faces here, I can see it says polygon 427 selected. Every single polygon is numbered. Okay, they have IDs to them, and so by extruding this, I basically put a command in the max to extrude, you know, polygon 424, polygon 427, polygon 404, and polygon 407. But the problem is I can come back to max, and I'm going to get this back to box, and I'm going to get this warning that says modifier exists in the stack that is depends on topology, which means the polygons that are here. So, are you sure you want to continue? So I'm going to say yes. But now any changes I make here, it's going to affect the number of polygons. So if I make this, you know, 5 by 5 by 5, what happened? What's going on, right? Let's say I go a little further up here, 8 by 8 by 8, trying to get a certain number to show up here. Let's make this 10 again. Okay. So now it's selecting these. And if I go back to edit poly, well, it's just doing what it's told. This is polygon 427. This is polygon 424. So these keep the same ID numbers. They're just located somewhere else because of the number of polygons. So ideally, we don't want to use this. Okay, so I'm going to delete that. So it's better to convert to editable poly. So right-click, convert. Now box is no longer an object, really. It's no longer a primitive object. It's now been converted to something that can be edited, and everything before this is basically gone. It's all been kind of baked into the object. Okay, so moving down, the FFD, this stands for free-form deformation. We have a 2x2, 3x3, 4x4 box and cylinder. So I'm just going to show these. I'm just going to use the 4x4 one. So it puts this lattice cage around our object. And if I go to my drop down here to the subcomponents or sub-object modes of FFD, and I go to control points, I can now select these control points, and it allows me to modify this object based on changing these control points. And all of these control points, they can be selected, I can scale them, and it will affect, kind of like if you're using in Photoshop, if you're using free transform to change an object or to scale a picture, it kind of works the same way in 2 dimensions. This one just works in 3 dimensions. So it allows me to go in here and modify this object. And it's pretty cool on some of the stuff that you can do. You can also move this entire cage. And see how it updates. So it only changes what's in the actual modifier, or what has actually been, whatever takes place inside of this lattice. Okay, so that's FFD. 2x2x2 and 3x3x3 just means how many control points there are. And then the box one is like the other ones, but I can set the number of points. And the cylinder one is the same idea. It's just a cylindrical cage or lattice. Flex, we'll leave that one for another one. Let's move on down the list. Melt. Melt's kind of a cheesy one. I don't know how handy it is. I just know that my students that I have like kind of messing around with it and animating this melting happening. It's kind of a gimmicky modifier. Let's see here, moving on down. Mount. Noise. Noise is a really good modifier. So noise allows us to apply irregularity to whatever object we have based on a strength. So if I type in 10 by 10 by 10, which should be 10 units by 10 units, not a whole lot really happens here. But as I change this higher, you can see that this changes the object very drastically, and it just kind of warps it. But what we can do is, if I go back to 10 by 10, I have options here for fractal, which gives me more irregularity. So if I wanted to make something like a piece of like warped wood or something like that, or if I wanted to take a section of a car that I made and make it look like it's getting kind of mangled, I could do that. The scale here changes how much this noise is affecting from basically point A to point B. It's allowing this to happen more and more along each direction. So the higher this number is, it actually will smooth out, and the lower, kind of the more drastic it's going to affect. The seed value here, this is basically creating a random displacement. I can duplicate this object and use exactly the same settings, but I can change that random number generator that is kind of affecting my object here. So I can have two objects that are very, very similar in style as far as like what's going on with them, but the seed will allow me to change them up slightly. Well, it's not slight, it's a lot, but what I'm saying is, like, it's not changing the strength so that it's so far different. It's using exactly the same settings, it's just altering how those settings are kind of working, just not the amount they're working. So under fractal I also have the roughness, so I can exaggerate that. I have iterations, so the lower my iterations, come on, the smoother this gets, and the more the iterations, the noisier it gets. And I can also animate this noise. So if I turn on animate noise, it's going to set keys at the beginning and end of my timeline, and you'll see the animation take place there. We can just turn that back off. So this works really nice for a bunch of things. You can do terrain with this as well. It works really nicely, but that's something that I like to do with it. So we'll just remove noise from there. We'll go back down through. Let's see. After noise, normal is always good. Normal is going to be hard to see because we have back faces turned on. So I'm going to go in here and say Object Properties. So I'm right click, Object Properties, Backface Call, which means don't draw back face. And now we can see what normal is actually doing. So it's flipping our polygons inside out. So it's flipping the direction the face is pointing. So we have our normal direction, which is this, which means it's pointing outward, and we have our back face direction, which is the other side, but now we're actually showing the back face and not the normal face. So we've essentially flipped this object inside out, and that can be handy. There are times where you accidentally flip things and have to change that. Okay, going down through push. Push is really nice. So what push allows us to do is it pushes all of these polygons out in their normal direction. So as I go a positive number here, it's pushing everything out, and you'll see it expanding the ones here that are shared between these sides. A good way to actually see this work is if I take something like the teapot. Oops, I'm just going to add some more segments here. So if I take this and I put a push modifier on it, there we go. And I push this out. See how it kind of fattens everything up. How this is really handy is if we have something like a human hand that we've modeled, and maybe we use that for multiple characters, and if I wanted to use it for maybe a female character, I could take this negative direction and make the fingers a little thinner on it easily. Or if I made a female hand and I need to make it a little bit bigger, let's say I'm making it for the Hulk, I could then push all of it out in every direction to thicken it up. So that's what push does. Alright, moving on down through, relax is another really good tool. So to show what relax does, I'm going to apply noise again. So, okay, so there's my noise. So normally if I have, let's say I've been modeling and I have, you know, polygons that I need to smooth out, or I have an area that just, you know, let's actually just effect, I'm going to cut this off of here, and I'm going to convert this to editable poly, and just select a portion of this. Come on. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm going to paste this back on. Now my modifier is only going to affect the polygon. See how polygon is lit up here still? It's only affecting that portion of this, which is also really handy. But let's say I wanted to, and I'm going to convert this here to edit poly, so that bakes in that modifier to it. I can't go back and change it now that that's happened. But let's say I had this area and I wanted this to be smoothed out. So I'm just going to select these edges and I'm going to apply relax. And so what I can do is if I turn this value up, I can start smoothing this out and reorganizing the topology to be a little more easy to manage, a little smoother. Now it does round out my corners, which, you know, I have to decide, you know, what I want to deal with here. But let's say I was making a car and I was working on the car hood and I was trying to get it nice and smooth, but, you know, my topology was in such a way that it was just kind of bumpy looking. Relax would work really good for just smoothing those areas out, and that's what it's really good for. So that's relax. Let's undo before I broke my mesh here. There we go. And we'll go back down through. Let's see. Shell is another one that's really good. I'm going to apply that to the teapot just so we can see how that works. So if we look at the teapot, I'm going to convert this to editable poly, and I'm going to take off the lid, and I'm going to convert, object properties, backface call. Okay, so see how we can see through the teapot because it doesn't have any drawn faces here. These are just back faces. And they're now not showing up because I told it not to draw back faces. If I put a shell modifier on here, and we're going to go the inner amount, so I'm just going to right click and set that to 0. So what shell allows us to do is I can actually give a certain amount of thickness based on this number. So if we look at before and after, we get this small amount of thickness here. So it's essentially doubling our polygons and giving us, you know, it's shelling the object. So that's what that's good for. And we'll get rid of that. It's important to note that you have to have an object selected to get down through any of these modifiers. Let's see here. Smooth. I can show what smooth does. Smooth allows us to smooth out hard edges in our polygons based on smoothing groups. So this is a little bit advanced, but I'll just kind of show how this can kind of work. So you can see right here I have a 90-degree angle and it's creating this hard edge. Well, right now my box is set up so that it's creating that hard edge. I can actually tell Max to ignore the fact that it's a 90-degree angle and override that by smoothing. So if I, it'll be tricky to show, but I'll show it after. So if I change this threshold to above 90 degrees, so if I set it at 91, notice that change that just happened there. Okay, I'm going to turn this off, back on. Okay. So now if I look at this, what's happening is it's told this to try to look like a smooth edge. So notice how it's trying to round that edge out, and it's not actually rounding it out. It's still a hard edge, but Max's shading is set up in a way that it's telling it, hey, you know, shade this so it looks rounded. So this is something that we can do in order to make objects, you know, look smoother than they actually are. So that's what smooth is good for. If you watch some of the modeling tutorials, I talk about smoothing groups, which actually goes a little further into detail, but that's the simplest way I can show that. Spherify is a great modifier. So it takes any object and tries to make it a sphere. Now, if we look at the actual sphere, turn my grid back on here, the actual sphere is not too bad as far as spheres go, but it has a pole vertex up at the top here, which means we have a bunch of vertices come into one spot. And this can cause some ugly stuff to happen with our topology, depending on what we're modeling. So in order to not have this, especially if we're going to be going into a program like Mudbox, we don't want to have that because Mudbox is not going to like it for sculpting. So a better way to create a sphere is to start with a box. And I know that sounds silly, but just go with me on this. So I'm going to create a length, width, and height segment here, box. So I'm just going to type in all the same numbers, and I'm going to give it the same segments here. Okay, so 10 by 10 by 10. And I'm going to apply Spherify. And it creates this box. Now this box is a little bit weird. Let me turn this to a different color so we can actually see what I'm talking about. So since that box has smoothing groups to separate the fronts and sides of this, it keeps those hard edges, or the smoothing between those hard edges. So something else I'm going to do, I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to set this to being 1 by 1 by 1. I'm going to use another modifier that you guys should become somewhat familiar with, which is Turbo Smooth. And I'm going to set this to have higher iterations. So the more iterations I add, the smoother this will become. So it's basically subdividing every polygon. So we start off, we have 1 by 1 by 1 by 1. If I set it to 1, it now subdivides each 1 by 4. And I'll do it again and again and again. So you want to be careful. Don't type in a really high number like 10, or else you'll probably crash your 3ds Max and lose some work. But as soon as I apply this, one thing we'll notice is that smoothing goes away. But once I apply this, if I add Spherify to this, you'll notice that this object was not actually a perfect sphere. So you can see here, as I turn it on, it actually rounds it out more. And this is actually a really nice sphere because of the way light will react with these polygons. There's no pole vertices really anywhere, which is really handy. So that's what Spherify is good for. It's also good for, if I have a box, I'll give myself a lot of height segments here. Let's say I don't want this, hold on, give myself segments around here. Sorry. So let's say I want to create a round set of edge loops here. So I'm going to convert this to edit poly. And if I double click on these edge loops that go all the way around, I can actually say Spherify just those edge loops. and it ends up making that perfectly round. Now, it becomes tedious to do so, but if we've modeled in a way that we've extruded a character's arm, and when we smooth or something like that, it becomes very boxy, I can sit here and go through, select the edges, apply Spherify, and fix this problem. Now, it takes a little bit of time to do that, but it's a way to fix that problem. You can see now that these areas are becoming perfectly round. So that's another way we can use this, and it works really nicely. I wish they would make one that called like Cylindrify that would allow us to do exactly what I'm trying to do here, or just make it to where this Spherify, because if I have multiple edges selected when I do this, it tries to turn these into a sphere, which is not what I want. So I'll show you what I mean. This is why you have to do one at a time. So see how it's trying to round that whole thing out? It's not really handy. So that's why I have to do one at a time. Sorry. I'm sure that sounds really great. Alright, so continuing on. Let's go down through after Spherify. Let's see, stretch works really nicely for doing squash and stretch animation. So that's just what it's set up to do. So if you're going to do a ball bounce animation or something and you want to add a bit of impact to it, you can have it kind of squish down and stretch up. Same idea with the axes here, and same idea with the amplify. So I can make it a lot more or a lot less stretchy looking. That's a nice tool to use. Let's see here. Symmetry is a nice modifier. I'm going to put that on the teapot just because it's easier to show there. Turn our segments down here. So if I apply Spherify or Symmetry, it will take whatever is on one half and make it symmetrical with the other half. You can also tell it to flip the other direction, so in case I want two handles, I could do that, and we can see how that looks. I could also change my direction, so if I did my Z direction, well, my pivot point for that object was at the bottom, so I can't flip that way, but I can flip that direction. And we won't actually see anything happen in the Y direction because it's already symmetrical in the Y value, or the Y axis. This works really nice if you've modeled one half of a character and you want to make the other half. So that is Symmetry. Taper. So taper allows us to taper and have a curve. This works really nicely if you've kind of modeled like some cartoon style buildings, and let's say you modeled them nice and straight, but you wanted to kind of give the effect of them being larger or smaller at the top. Works really nice for that sort of thing. You can change the axes here to do different things, and it has the limit effects as well. Taper, turbo smooth we already kind of talked about. Last one we're going to talk about is twist. So what twist will allow us to do is it allows us to twist our object, and we can see what that looks like. So we have our bias, which allows us to change whether or not it's twisted more at the top or bottom. We can change our axis. We have a limit effect. But the last thing I want to show is how these modifiers work together in this modifier stack, because so far I've really only shown one modifier at a time. So I'm going to say this object is twisting 90 degrees. I'm going to go into my box here, make this object a lot taller, and I'm going to give myself a lot more height segments. So that way my twist is nice and smooth. Let's go ahead and twist this 360 degrees. So it's doing a full, that's a bit much. Let's go 180. Okay, so it's twisted up 180 degrees. Now if I apply a bend, I can now affect this and have it bend 360 degrees. And now we make this mind-bending thing where the one side comes up and around and back through, which is pretty cool. The more we twist it, the weirder it gets. So every 90 degrees gets a little weirder. It's kind of cool looking though. But let me change this back to just 90. The important thing is how these modifiers are put together. So first we twist, then we bend. If I do the opposite, so I'm just going to drag this down below, we get a very different object. So in this case, I've bent it to 360 degrees, and then I've started twisting this. So you can see that's very different compared to what we had. And that's really how the basic modifiers work, and you can use them together in many different ways. There's a bunch of other ones, so I'm going to do I may end up doing different tutorials for some of these other ones. Some of the other ones that I do want to cover in another video is going to be path deform, which is really good. I have 2 videos that talk about cloth, so go check those out if you want to know about how cloth works. It works together with where is it? Oh, it's with Garment Maker. I just don't see that here. Some of the other ones that we can talk about is flex, so we can do some stuff with flex. Let's see, morpher. I could do. I might have a video already on blend shapes and morph targets using morpher, but I have to check back on that. I think I have one. If not, I can do one on that. Let's see. Skinning, I mean, there's a whole thing on skinning that I can do. So those will be some later videos coming up. If you haven't seen already, I've started on my channel I'll just go here and show you. So if we go to my subscriptions, not my subscriptions, but this takes me to YouTube easy. And I'm going to go to my videos here. So I've started this quickies for commenters, and this is just the series introduction, but if you have a comment or there's something that you specifically want to see created, go ahead and leave me a comment here. You can comment on any of my videos. I'll be able to get back to it. But you can comment here and say, hey, I'd really like to see a video on, let's see. Let me go back here. So somebody had commented on this welcome video, which is why I'm making this video. Can you make a tutorial about some of the most useful modifiers in 3ds Max? So as you can see, I do read and reply as much as I can. If I haven't replied to yours video, then give me some time. I should be able to get around to that. Some of them don't let me reply. Some of them don't show up on here because they're flagged as spam. So as long as I see them and as long as it's something I can reply to, I try to do that. But leave me a comment and let me know what it is you want to see, and I'll try to do a video on it if it's something that's in my ability. But anyway, thanks for watching. Please subscribe. If you found this video entertaining or if you found it useful, please give me a like. You can definitely use that, and share it with anybody you think might find this interesting. So thanks a lot.